He built an empire with blood and bone, and the kind of patience that turns men into monuments. King Thorne Valerius answered every rebellion with steel, every betrayal with silence, every war with victory. And then his own wife kissed another man in his own palace, and the monument cracked from the inside. This is not a story about revenge. This is about what happens when the most powerful man alive discovers that power cannot stop the one wound that actually kills. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like. Tell me what city you are watching from. Let us begin. The first snow of the season fell on Hollowspire like ash from a burning world. It collected on the black marble ledges and melted against the heat rising from the forges beneath the citadel, where men hammered weapons they prayed would never be needed. The walls of the palace were older than memory, older than any living bloodline, and they carried the cold the way ancient things always did, not as discomfort, but as warning. King Thorne Valerius stood at the narrow window of his private study, watching the snow descend over the city below. His hands were flat against the stone sill. His knuckles had gone white, though no one was present to see it. He was 43 years old. His shoulders carried the thickness of a man who had fought wars in his 20s and spent his 30s learning that politics killed slower, but with greater cruelty. A scar ran from his left temple to the edge of his jaw, a gift from a siege he never spoke about, and his dark hair had begun to silver at the temples in a way that made lesser men look distinguished, but made Thorne look like something weathering a storm that had not yet ended. He had not slept in 4 days, not from illness, not from war, from the kind of silence that settles inside a man when he knows something is wrong but has not yet allowed himself to name it. The door opened behind him, heavy oak on iron hinges. The sound was familiar enough that he did not turn. "Your Majesty." General Cale Ashford's voice filled the room the way smoke fills a closed space, slow and impossible to ignore. "The Winter Conclave delegation has arrived. House Varen, House Dremora, House Blackshore." "And House Valor?" Kyle paused. "And House Valor." Thorne finally turned. Kyle stood near the doorway in his military leathers, a man built like a siege tower, broad and scarred and deeply uncomfortable in rooms that smelled like ink instead of iron. He had served Thorne since the border campaigns, back when loyalty was tested by whether a man stood beside you when arrows fell, not by whether he smiled correctly at banquets. "Celine arrived with the Valor contingent this morning," Cale said carefully. "I am aware. She brought Chancellor Draxon." "I am aware of that as well." Cale studied his king. He had watched Thorne face cavalry charges without flinching, had seen him negotiate with warlords who ate prisoners, had stood beside him when the old king died and the crown passed to a young man who had no right to look that calm while holding that much weight. But something in Thorne's posture tonight disturbed him. It was not anger, it was not grief. It was the stillness of a man conserving energy for something he had not yet decided to do. "Kyle, sire, when you were stationed at Fort Dravenmarch before I recalled you to court, did your wife remain faithful?" The question landed like a blade dropped on stone. Kyle's jaw tightened. His eyes shifted, then steadied. "She did not." "How did you know?" "I knew because she stopped arguing with me. A woman who cares enough to fight with you still considers you worth the effort. When the fighting stops and the smiling starts, that is when a man should worry." Thorne absorbed this. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, like a door closing in a distant hallway of a very large house. "And what did you do?" "I burned every letter she ever wrote me, drank for a week. Then I rode north and killed enough enemies to fill the silence." "Did it work?" "No." Cale's voice dropped. "It never works. You just get better at pretending it did." Thorne nodded slowly. He crossed the study to a table where a map of Vareth lay pinned beneath bronze weights. The map showed an empire that stretched from the frozen ridges of the Ashenvale Mountains to the golden ports of the Sunder Coast. 12 provinces, 9 major houses, 4 million souls living beneath banners that bore his name. All of it governed by a man who could not govern the silence in his own chambers. "The conclave begins at sundown," he said. "Make sure the eastern gallery is secured. I want no servants in the upper corridors after the second bell." "You expecting trouble?" "I am expecting politics, which is the same thing with better clothing." Cale almost smiled. Almost. He saluted and left. Thorne remained alone with the map and the snow and the weight of a question he had been avoiding for months. He already knew the answer. He had known since autumn, when the letters between Céline and Lucien had shifted from formal correspondence to something that arrived sealed with unmarked wax and disappeared into private drawers. He had known since the night he reached for her in bed and found her body present but her mind somewhere else entirely. The way a soldier is present at a post he has already decided to abandon. But knowing and confronting were different currencies in the economy of power. A common man could confront his wife at the dinner table, shout, weep, throw things, and the damage was contained within four walls. A king who confronted his empress shook the foundations of provinces. Alliances trembled, trade routes wavered. Armies that swore loyalty to a united crown began whispering about which half deserved their swords. So Thorne did what kings had done since the first crown was forged from the first stolen gold. He watched, he waited, he endured, and he hated himself for every silent second of it. The Winter Conclave was a tradition older than the Valerius dynasty. Every year, as the first deep frost settled across Verith, the noble houses gathered at Hollowspire to negotiate trade agreements, resolve territorial disputes, and remind each other through elaborate courtesy that they were all one poorly worded insult away from open warfare. The conclave lasted 7 nights. Alliances were tested, marriages were proposed, and beneath every toast and every dance, the real negotiations happened in whispered corners where candlelight could not reach. The moon ascension ball marked the 3rd night. Thorne descended the central staircase of Hollowspire, wearing black and silver, the colors of his house. His crown was a simple circlet of dark iron, unadorned, forged from the chains of the first tyrant his bloodline had overthrown. He wore it the way other men wore scars, not as decoration, but as reminder. The grand hall below him churned with silk and ambition. 300 nobles from every corner of the empire filled the marble floor, their laughter rising like steam, their smiles sharpened to diplomatic precision. Music floated from a string ensemble positioned in the western alcove, something elegant and deliberately inoffensive, the kind of melody designed to make powerful people feel cultured while they plotted against each other. Thorne moved through the crowd the way a wolf moved through tall grass. He did not hurry. He did not linger. He acknowledged greetings with measured nods, accepted compliments with responses calibrated to reveal nothing, and kept his eyes moving across the room with the disciplined sweep of a man who understood that in gatherings like these, the most important conversations were the ones you were not invited to. Lord Matthias Varen approached first. He was 60 years old, built like a barrel wrapped in velvet, with a white beard that he stroked constantly as if reassuring himself it was still there. He governed the eastern provinces, where iron mines funded half the empire's military. Your Majesty, a magnificent evening. Lord Varen, your mines produce 17% less ore this quarter. I trust you will address that before spring. Varen's smile froze like water on cold stone. There were complications. Flooding in the lower shafts, labor disputes. There are always complications. I am interested in results. Of course, Your Majesty. Thorne moved on before Varen could redirect the conversation toward the tax relief he had been lobbying for since autumn. That was the trick of court interaction. Engage long enough to establish dominance. Disengage before the other party found footing. Lady Isolde Blackshore intercepted him near the wine tables. She was younger than most house leaders, 31, sharp-featured, with auburn hair pulled back in a style that suggested she had better things to do than spend hours on appearance. She governed the coastal provinces and commanded the largest naval fleet in the empire. Thorne respected her because she was competent. He watched her because competence in a political environment was often indistinguishable from ambition. You look tired, Your Majesty. I look like a man governing an empire during a famine winter. Tired is the appropriate aesthetic. She studied him with eyes that missed very little. Céline looks radiant tonight. The observation was not casual. Nothing Isolde said was casual. The Empress has always understood the value of presentation. Presentation. Isolde tasted the word. Yes, she presents beautifully. One might even say she has been presenting with particular enthusiasm lately. Thorne held her gaze. The silence between them lasted 3 heartbeats. In court, 3 heartbeats of silence was an eternity. Careful, Lady Blackshore. I am always careful, Your Majesty. That is why I still have a navy. She dipped her head and withdrew into the crowd. Thorne watched her go. She knew, or at least she suspected. And if Isolde Blackshore suspected, then the rumor had already spread further than he had estimated. The realization settled in his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. He needed air. He moved toward the eastern gallery, a long corridor that ran along the outer wall of the palace, lined with tall windows that overlooked the valley below. It was quieter here. The music faded to a distant hum. The candlelight grew sparse, replaced by the pale blue glow of moonlight filtering through frosted glass. He walked slowly, letting the cold air press against his face. His boots echoed on the marble. The sound reminded him of his father, who had walked these same corridors decades earlier, back when the empire was smaller and the threats were simpler. His father had taught him that a king's greatest weapon was not his army or his treasury, but his ability to remain still when everything around him demanded reaction. "Be the eye of the storm," the old king had said. "Let the world spin. Let men rage. You remain still. You remain watching. And when the moment arrives, you move once, and you move final." Thorne had lived by those words for 20 years, but his father had never addressed what happened when the storm was inside you. He turned a corner and stopped. The balcony at the end of the eastern gallery was partially concealed by heavy curtains. Moonlight poured through the gap between fabric and stone, casting a narrow blade of silver across the floor. And in that silver light, two figures stood close enough that the space between them had ceased to exist. Selene wore deep crimson tonight, the color of House Valor. Her dark hair was pinned with silver clasps that caught the moonlight and scattered it like sparks. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful. It was the first thing he had noticed about her and the last thing that mattered. Lucian Draxon stood facing her. He was tall, lean, constructed with the kind of deliberate elegance that made other men feel clumsy. His features were sharp enough to cut, his eyes dark and calculating, and his hands, the hands of a man who had never held a weapon but had signed documents that destroyed entire families. Those hands rested against Selene's throat, not gripping, cradling. The gesture of a man who had touched her there many times before and knew exactly how she responded. Selene's eyes were closed, her lips parted, and when Lucian kissed her, there was no hesitation, no urgency, no guilt. It was the kiss of two people who had long ago stopped wondering whether they should and had settled comfortably into the rhythm of always. Thorne watched. His body did not move. His expression did not change. But inside, something fundamental rearranged itself, the way tectonic plates shift deep beneath mountains, invisible on the surface, catastrophic in consequence. There is a specific kind of pain that belongs exclusively to men who have spent their lives being strong. It does not arrive as sadness. It arrives as silence. A sudden, absolute quiet that fills the chest and the throat and the space behind the eyes, as if the body has decided that feeling anything at all would be too dangerous, and has simply shut down every system capable of emotion. Thorne stood in that silence for 7 seconds. 7 seconds during which empires could have risen and fallen. Then he turned and walked back the way he came. His footsteps did not quicken. His breathing did not change. His hands remained at his sides. To anyone passing him in the corridor, he would have appeared exactly as he always appeared, controlled, composed, untouchable. But the man inside the king had just watched his marriage die, and the king inside the man was already calculating the political cost of the funeral. He returned to the grand hall. He drank wine he could not taste. He spoke to nobles whose names blurred together. He smiled when protocol demanded smiling. He stood beside a pillar and watched the celebration continue around him. 300 people laughing and dancing inside a palace whose foundation had just cracked, and not one of them knew. That was the loneliest realization of all, not the betrayal itself, but the understanding that no one would notice it, because kings were not permitted to bleed in public. The days that followed unfolded with the careful choreography of a man dismantling something dangerous one wire at a time. Thorne did not confront Selene. He did not summon Lucian. He did not whisper to advisors or dispatch agents or do any of the dramatic, visible things that lesser rulers did when their pride was wounded. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He began paying attention. He noticed that Selene's personal guard had been quietly reassigned over the past 6 months. Loyalists replaced by men who answered to Lucian's network. He noticed that 3 diplomatic pouches addressed to House Valor had been rerouted through channels that bypassed the imperial registry. He noticed that Lucian had made 2 unofficial visits to the Dremeren border, where foreign lords with territorial ambitions maintained estates suspiciously well-funded for men who claimed poverty. Each detail was small. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that Thorne recognized because he had used it himself during his own rise to power. Someone was building a coalition, and they were using his marriage as the foundation. He summoned Kael to the war room on the 5th night. The war room occupied the deepest level of Hollowspire, a windowless chamber carved from raw stone, lit by iron braziers that threw orange light across walls covered in maps and tactical projections. It smelled like metal and earth, and the particular tension that accumulated in rooms where men made decisions that determined whether other men lived or died. Thorne stood over a table covered in correspondence he had intercepted through channels even Lucian did not know existed. Kael stood opposite, reading each letter with the slow thoroughness of a man who understood that rushing through intelligence got people killed. "How long?" Kael said finally. "At least a year. Possibly longer." The affair or the conspiracy? They became the same thing sometime around midsummer. Kael set down the last letter. His face carried the expression of a man who had just been told the bridge he was standing on was made of rotting wood. House Valor controls 30,000 soldiers along the southern border. If Selene turns them against you publicly, half the eastern houses will follow out of fear alone. I know. Lucian has been negotiating with Lord Castivar across the Dremeren border. Castivar has been looking for an excuse to expand into our western provinces for a decade. I know. If they move together, if Selene provides legitimacy and Castivar provides foreign muscle, you are looking at a war on 2 fronts with half your own nobles uncertain which side to support. I know, Kael. Then what is the plan? Thorne looked at his general. The brazier light carved deep shadows across his face, aging him, revealing the exhaustion he hid during daylight hours. The plan is to let them believe they are winning. Kael stared at him. That is either brilliant or suicidal. In my experience, the best strategies are both. Thorne! Kael rarely used the king's name. When he did, it meant the conversation had moved beyond protocol into the territory where 2 men who had survived battlefields together could speak without titles. This is not a border skirmish. This is your wife. This is the woman who sleeps 10 rooms from where you are standing right now. She stopped being that woman a long time ago. Maybe, but you have not stopped being the man who married her. I can see it. You are carrying this like a wound you will not let anyone stitch. Thorne said nothing for a long moment. The braziers crackled. Somewhere above them, the palace continued its nightly performance of civility and splendor. A wound I let someone stitch is a wound I admit exists, he said quietly. And a king who admits he is wounded invites every predator in the empire to smell blood. So what? You just bleed quietly until you collapse. I bleed quietly until I find the right moment to stop the bleeding. There is a difference. Is there? There has to be. Kael exhaled through his nose. It was the sound of a man who disagreed but recognized that his king had made a decision and that further argument would be wasted breath. What do you need from me? Watch the southern garrisons track every message leaving Lucian's quarters and find out who in my council is already loyal to them. You think the rot has spread that far? I think power is a disease that spreads exactly as far as men allow it to, and I have allowed too much already. Kael gathered the correspondence and secured it inside his coat. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it is worth, I am sorry. Thorne looked at him. For the betrayal, Kael clarified. Save your sympathy for men who can afford it. Kael left. Thorne stood alone in the war room, surrounded by maps of an empire he had spent his life protecting, and felt the particular cruelty of a truth he could not share with anyone. He was not angry at Selene for loving someone else. He was angry at himself for still caring that she did. That was the secret weakness of every man who had ever been called strong. Not that they were incapable of pain, but that they had been taught since childhood to treat pain as failure, to suffer quietly, to absorb impact without flinching, to stand in burning buildings and call it composure. Thorne had mastered that discipline, but mastery and healing were not the same thing. And he was beginning to understand that a man could be entirely in control and entirely broken at the same time. 2 weeks after the conclave, Thorne departed Hollowspire under the pretense of inspecting the western provinces. The western territories of Vareth were the empire's forgotten children. Mountainous, cold, populated by communities that clung to valleys the way drowning men clung to driftwood. Famine had struck the region hard that year. Grain reserves that should have sustained villages through winter had been diverted through imperial supply channels that somehow delivered less than half of what was dispatched. The mathematics of corruption were simple. Food entered the system at one end. Officials extracted their share at every checkpoint. By the time supplies reached the people who needed them, there was barely enough to feed a single household, let alone a province. Thorne traveled with a reduced escort. 50 mounted soldiers, no banners, no heralds, no ceremonial procession. He wanted to see the provinces as they were, not as they arranged themselves when a king was watching. The first village he entered had no name that appeared on any imperial map. It sat in a narrow valley between two ridges of gray stone, 30 wooden structures clustered around a frozen stream. Smoke rose from half the chimneys. The other half were cold. Thorne did not need to ask why. Cold chimneys meant empty homes. Empty homes meant people had either fled or died. He dismounted and walked through the village on foot. His boots sank into mud and half-frozen earth. The air smelled like wood smoke and something else, something thin and sour that he recognized from battlefield hospitals. Hunger had a smell. It was faint and metallic, like blood that had dried a long time ago. A woman watched him from the doorway of a structure that was barely standing. She was perhaps 50, but looked 70. Her skin was drawn tight across her cheekbones. Her eyes followed him with the dull wariness of someone who had learned that powerful men in fine clothing never brought good news. Thorne stopped before her. How many in this village? 87 last count, 12 less since the snow started. Where did the 12 go? Where do you think? He understood. The grain shipments from Hollowspire, did they arrive? She looked at him as if he had asked whether the sun rose in the west. Imperial wagons came through 6 weeks back. The soldiers unloaded half the grain into the storehouse. The other half they took to the regional administrator's estate down the valley. We were told it was for redistribution. We never saw it again. Thorne felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not surprise. He was long past surprise when it came to the creative theft practiced by imperial officials. What he felt was something closer to exhaustion, the bone-deep fatigue of a man who had spent 20 years building systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this, only to discover that corruption adapted faster than policy. Who is the regional administrator? Lord Halvor Kren, appointed by Chancellor Draxon 2 years ago. Of course, Lucien's fingerprints were everywhere, not because the man personally orchestrated every act of petty corruption in the empire, but because he had built a network of appointments that ensured loyal men occupied positions where theft was both easy and invisible. It was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was a system designed to function exactly as intended, extracting wealth from the bottom and funneling it upward through layers of bureaucratic insulation that made accountability impossible. Thorne ordered his escort commander to locate Lord Kren and bring him to the village square within the hour. Then he walked to the storehouse. It was a long wooden building at the edge of the village, its doors secured with an imperial lock. Thorne broke the lock with his boot. Inside, the shelves were nearly empty. A few sacks of grain sat in the corner, barely enough to sustain the village for a week. The rest of the space was filled with dust and the particular silence of a room that should have contained something vital, but did not. He stood in that empty storehouse and thought about what it meant. 12 people had died in this village this winter. Not from invasion, not from plague, not from any force that a king could ride out and defeat with sword and banner. They died because someone in a comfortable office had decided that their grain was worth more as profit than as sustenance. They died because the system designed to protect them had been quietly converted into a machine for extracting their survival and converting it into someone else's luxury. And the man who had built that machine was currently sleeping with the king's wife. There was a kind of poetry in that. Dark, bitter, nauseating poetry. Thorne exited the storehouse and found a woman standing in his path. She was not tall, perhaps 5'6". She wore a heavy wool coat patched at the elbows and work boots caked with mud that had dried in layers suggesting weeks of continuous use. Her hair was dark with threads of silver, pulled back in a manner that prioritized function over appearance. Her face was weathered in the way that faces became weathered when they spent more time outdoors than in, wind-roughened, sun-marked, with lines around the eyes that could have been from squinting against bright snow, or from years of expressions that carried more concern than joy. She held a leather ledger in her hands. "You are the king," she said. It was not a question. It was not spoken with awe or deference or the rehearsed reverence that courtiers deployed like currency. It was stated as fact, the way someone might observe that it was raining. "I am. My name is Seraphine Moura. I am the steward of Ashen Hollow, the estate 12 miles north. I manage provisions for 6 villages in this valley, including this one. You manage provisions that apparently do not arrive. They do not arrive because they are stolen before they reach us. I have documented every discrepancy for the past 18 months. She held out the ledger. Thorne took it. He opened it and began reading. The entries were meticulous: dates, quantities, origins, destinations, discrepancies between what was dispatched and what was received. She had tracked every shipment, every diversion, every official who signed off on transfers that never materialized. The mathematics were devastating. Over 18 months, more than 60% of all grain allocated to the western provinces had been redirected to private stores controlled by regional administrators appointed through Lucian's network. 60%. Thorne closed the ledger. He looked at Seraphine Moura, this woman in her mud-caked boots with her meticulous records and her complete absence of fear. "You compiled this alone. Who else was going to do it? The official stealing the grain. You could have sent this to the capital, to the imperial auditors." She looked at him with an expression that carried more weight than any diplomatic speech he had ever endured. "Imperial channels feed politics first, and starving children second." The words landed in his chest like a hammer strike, not because they were disrespectful, because they were true. His guard shifted uncomfortably. One of them stepped forward. "You will address the king with proper respect." Seraphine did not look at the guard. She kept her eyes on Thorne. Respect is not a tone of voice. Respect is making sure people do not starve to death inside an empire rich enough to feed them 3 times over. The guard reached for her arm. "Stand down," Thorne said. The guard froze. "I said stand down." The guard withdrew. Thorne studied Seraphine for a long moment. The snow was falling harder now, collecting on her shoulders, melting in her hair. She did not brush it away. She stood in the cold the way someone stood who was accustomed to enduring things that more comfortable people avoided. "Walk with me," he said. They walked through the village together, past the cold chimneys and the empty doorways, and the children who watched from windows with eyes too old for their faces. Seraphine spoke without prompting, describing the conditions across the valley, the failed harvests, the diverted supplies, the families that had dissolved as parents sent children to relatives in distant provinces because they could no longer feed them. Thorne listened. He listened the way a man listens when he has spent too long hearing only what people thought he wanted to hear. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, the noise inside his head quieted, not because the problems were simple, they were catastrophically complex, but because the woman walking beside him spoke about them with the kind of clarity that only came from someone who had nothing to gain and nothing to hide. By evening, Lord Kren had been dragged from his estate and brought to the village square. He was a round man in expensive furs, sweating despite the cold, his eyes darting between the king and the soldiers and the villagers who had gathered to watch. Thorne read the charges from Seraphine's ledger. Every diverted shipment, every forged document, every sack of grain that had been stolen from people who were dying. Kren stammered. He invoked Lucian's name, he claimed authorization, he begged. Thorne ordered him arrested and stripped of all titles and holdings. The man was dragged away weeping into the snow. The villagers watched in silence, not celebration, silence, because they had seen officials removed before, and new ones always arrived who were just as hungry. But something in the king's face told them this time might be different. That night, Thorne sat beside a fire on the edge of the village. His escort had established a perimeter, but he had ordered them to maintain distance. He wanted space. He needed it, the way a man who had been holding his breath for too long needed air. Seraphine appeared without announcement. She carried 2 tin cups of something hot that turned out to be a bitter herbal brew that tasted like boiled pine needles and determination. She sat on the opposite side of the fire. The flames painted her face in orange and shadow. "You arrested Kren," she said. "I did. Another one will replace him." "Possibly." "Then what changes?" "The system changes, or it does not. But tonight, a man who stole food from starving people is sleeping in chains instead of silk, and that is enough for tonight." She studied him across the fire. The wind carried snow between them. The mountains above were invisible in the darkness, their presence felt only as an absence of stars along the horizon. "Are you feared because you are powerful, Your Majesty? Or powerful because people fear you?" The question hit him sideways. Not because it was clever, because it was sincere. She was not testing him. She was not probing for weakness. She genuinely wanted to know. And Thorne, who had answered 10,000 questions from 10,000 people who all wanted something from him, found himself unable to answer this one, because the honest response was that he did not know anymore. That is a dangerous question to ask a king. Everything worth asking is dangerous. Safe questions get safe answers, and safe answers do not fix anything. He looked at her through the firelight. "You are not afraid of me." "I am afraid of plenty of things, Your Majesty." "Winter. Famine. The look on a mother's face when she cannot feed her child. You're not on that list." "Why not?" "Because a man who rides 5 days through mountain snow to see whether villages are starving is not the kind of man I need to be afraid of. He is the kind of man I need to believe still exists." The fire cracked. Embers rose into the dark sky. Thorne drank the terrible pine brew and said nothing for a long time. And in that silence, something shifted inside him. Not dramatically, not like a revelation or a sudden awakening. More like a door that had been locked for years developing a crack in its frame. Not open, not yet, but no longer sealed. He stayed in the western provinces for 11 days. Each day he rode to a different village, a different estate, a different failing outpost of imperial governance. And each day Seraphine rode with him, because she knew these valleys the way he knew palace corridors, intimately, instinctively, with the kind of knowledge that came from years of walking the same ground until it became part of your body. She showed him things his reports never contained. She showed him the widow in Thornfield who had taught herself to stretch a single sack of grain across 3 months by mixing it with ground bark. She showed him the children in Ashen Hollow who had organized a hunting rotation, 9-year-olds tracking rabbits through snow because no adult had time to feed them. She showed him the old man in Crestfall who had dismantled his own roof to build shelters for families whose homes had collapsed under the weight of winter. These were not statistics. These were people. And Thorne, who had spent decades governing through numbers and strategy and the cold calculus of empire, found himself shaken by the simple, devastating humanity of it. On the 9th night, after a day spent distributing emergency supplies from the military reserves he had redirected over Kael's protests, Thorne and Seraphine sat on a ridge overlooking Ashen Hollow. The valley below was dark except for scattered firelight from village windows. The sky above was clear for the first time in weeks, and the stars were so thick they looked like someone had shattered a mirror across the heavens. They had been talking for hours, not about policy, not about the empire, about the things people talked about when titles and positions were stripped away, and all that remained were 2 voices in the dark. She told him about growing up in these mountains, about her father, a blacksmith who died when she was 16, leaving her to manage an estate that no noble family wanted because it produced nothing valuable enough to steal. About the years she spent learning to read ledgers and negotiate with traders and argue with officials who assumed a woman without a title was a woman without authority. He told her things he had never told anyone, about the weight of the crown, about the silence in his chambers, about the way power had slowly, methodically replaced every genuine human connection in his life with transactions disguised as relationships. He did not mention Celine. He did not need to. Seraphine watched him the way she watched everything, directly, without pretense, with the kind of attention that made a man feel simultaneously exposed and safe. "You carry everything alone," she said. "That is the job." "No, the job is to govern. Carrying everything alone is the price you have decided to pay for governing. They are not the same thing. In my experience, they become the same thing eventually. Then your experience has been with the wrong people." The wind shifted. The cold deepened. Their breath formed clouds that mingled briefly between them before dissolving into the night. Seraphine. Yes, I should tell you that I am not a good man. I did not ask you to be a good man. I asked you a question about power 9 days ago, and you still have not answered it. He almost laughed, not quite, but closer than he had come in months. You are relentless. I manage 6 villages, 1,200 people, and a grain supply that disappears every time an official looks at it sideways. Relentless is a job requirement. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. Not as a king assessing a subject, not as a man calculating advantage. As a human being seeing another human being clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. She was not beautiful in the way that court women were beautiful, constructed, polished, presented. She was beautiful in the way that mountains were beautiful, weathered and strong and entirely indifferent to whether anyone noticed. He wanted to tell her this. He said nothing, because wanting something honest terrified him more than any army ever had. On the 11th day, a rider arrived from Hollowspire carrying a sealed message from Kael. Thorne read it alone in his tent. The message was brief. 3 lines in Kael's blunt handwriting. Lucien has dispatched private envoys to Lord Castevar. Celine has requested an audience with the Southern House commanders. The game is accelerating. Come home. Thorne folded the letter and held it over the candle until it caught fire. He watched it burn. The flame consumed Kael's words, but the information remained, seared into his mind the way all dangerous knowledge was, permanent, inescapable, and heavy enough to bend a man's spine if he let it. He emerged from the tent and found Seraphine waiting outside. She held the reins of his horse and her own. She had already packed supplies for the return journey, as if she had known before he did that the message would summon him back. "You are leaving," she said. "I have to." "I know." They stood facing each other in the gray morning light. Snow dusted her shoulders. The mountains rose behind her, indifferent and eternal. Seraphine. Go. Do what kings do. Save the empire or burn it down or whatever it is you decide. And if I come back, then you come back. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I have. He mounted his horse. His escort assembled around him. The column began to move east, toward the capital, toward the palace, toward everything he had built, and everything that was trying to tear it apart. He looked back once. She stood exactly where he had left her. The wind moved her hair. She did not wave. That was when he knew. Not because of some grand romantic revelation, not because music swelled or destiny whispered. He knew because she was the only person in his entire empire who had not asked him for a single thing. The only person who looked at him and saw not a crown or a throne or a weapon or an alliance, but a man standing in the snow, exhausted and wounded and trying to do the right thing in a world that punished you for it. And that terrified him more than the conspiracy waiting at Hollowspire, because he could fight armies. He could outmaneuver traitors, but he had no defense against someone who simply, quietly, without agenda or ambition, saw him. The ride back to the capital took 5 days. On the final night, camped in the foothills outside the city, Thorne sat alone and stared at the distant lights of Hollowspire glittering on the horizon like a crown made of fire. Inside those walls, his wife was conspiring with his chancellor to destroy him. Behind him, in a valley he was already missing, a woman he barely knew had cracked open something inside him that he had spent 2 decades sealing shut. And ahead of him, the empire waited, indifferent to his pain, demanding his strength, consuming his life one decision at a time. He touched the iron crown resting beside him on the saddle blanket. It was cold. It was always cold. But for the first time, the cold felt like a question rather than an answer. And the question was simple. How long could a man survive as king before the king consumed the man entirely? He did not sleep that night, because the answer frightened him, and because, somewhere in the western mountains, a woman with muddy boots and a leather ledger and absolutely no fear of him was already becoming the most dangerous thing in his empire. Not because she threatened his crown, but because she made him wonder whether the crown was worth what it cost. Hollowspire swallowed him whole the moment he passed through the northern gate. The city had changed in 11 days, or maybe he had changed and the city simply looked different through wounded eyes. The streets were the same cobblestone arteries pumping commerce and ambition through the capital's iron heart, the same merchants shouting prices, the same soldiers patrolling walls that had never been breached, the same banners hanging from every tower, black and silver, bearing the Valerius wolf, snapping in winter wind like the jaws of something hungry. But Thorne saw it all now through a lens cracked down the middle. One half showed the empire he had built. The other half showed the empire being hollowed out beneath him while he was busy holding the roof up. He dismounted in the inner courtyard. His boots hit the flagstones and the sound echoed off walls that were 4 stories of black marble and bad history. Stable hands rushed forward. Attendants materialized from doorways. The machinery of royal service engaged with practiced efficiency. Every movement rehearsed. Every gesture calibrated to communicate devotion without requiring any. Kyle met him at the entrance to the private wing. The general looked like he had not slept since sending that letter. His eyes carried the bloodshot urgency of a man who had been watching a fire spread and lacked the authority to sound the alarm. "How bad?" Thorne said. "Worse than the letter." They walked side by side through the corridor. Their boots struck the marble in unison, a rhythm born from years of marching together through places far more dangerous than palace hallways. Kale spoke in the low, clipped cadence he reserved for situations where volume itself was a liability. "Lucien dispatched 3 separate envoys to Lord Castevar while you were gone. 2 returned. The 3rd stayed. That means negotiations have moved past the feeling-out phase and into specifics." "What kind of specifics?" "Territory, western provinces. Castevar wants mineral rights to the Ashenvale Range in exchange for military support if Celine makes a public claim against you." "A public claim?" "Legitimacy challenge. She is positioning the narrative that you have become unstable, distracted, unfit. The Western inspection trip is being reframed as abandonment of duty." Thorne stopped walking. "I rode west to prevent people from starving, and they are spinning it as a king who left his capital during a political crisis to play farmer in the mountains." Here was the mathematics of power stripped to its ugliest equation. Do the right thing, and your enemies used your decency as ammunition. Do nothing, and people died. Every choice bled. The only question was which wound you could survive. They entered the war room. Kyle closed the door and engaged the iron bolt. The room was exactly as Thorne had left it. Maps on the walls, braziers burning low, the smell of old stone and fresh anxiety. "There is something else," Kyle said. "Of course there is." "Celine requested a private audience with Lady Blackshore 3 days ago." Isolde agreed. Thorne felt that one in his chest. Isolde Blackshore controlled the navy. Whoever held the navy controlled the coastline. Whoever controlled the coastline controlled trade. And whoever controlled trade could strangle the empire's economy without firing a single arrow. "Did Isolde commit?" "Not yet. But she took the meeting. That alone sends a signal." "What signal?" "That the most powerful naval commander in Vareth considers your wife's conspiracy worth listening to. Even if Isolde ultimately sides with you, the fact that she entertained the conversation means other houses will see it as permission to explore their options." This was how empires actually fell. Not in grand battles or dramatic sieges. They fell in quiet meetings between people who calculated that loyalty to the existing order was becoming more expensive than investment in a new one. They fell when the math changed, when fear of the current king became less persuasive than the promises of the next one. Thorne sat down at the table. The chair was hard oak with no cushion. He had designed the war room that way deliberately. Comfort encouraged complacency. Discomfort kept the mind sharp. But tonight the discomfort was not in the chair. It was everywhere. "Summon the council for dawn. Full attendance. No exceptions. Including Lucien. Especially Lucien." Kyle hesitated. "You want the man who is plotting to destroy you sitting at your council table." "I want the man who is plotting to destroy me to believe he is still safe enough to sit at my council table." There's a difference between inviting your enemy to dinner and letting him know you have seen the knife he is hiding. Kyle studied his king. Something in Thorne's voice had changed since the Western trip. Not softer, not harder. Something else. A clarity that had not been there before, as if a man who had been looking at the world through fogged glass had suddenly wiped it clean and was not entirely pleased with what he saw. "You found something out there," Kale said. "In the mountains." Thorne looked at him. "I found a lot of things. I'm not talking about corruption and grain shortages. I know what you are talking about. And it does not concern the council, the empire, or you." Kale held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. He was a soldier. He knew when a perimeter was being drawn. "Dawn, then." "Dawn. The council chamber occupied the second level of Hollowspire's central tower. It was a circular room with tall windows that admitted morning light in narrow blades that swept across the stone floor as the sun moved, a reminder that time passed regardless of what decisions were or were not being made inside. 12 chairs surrounded the obsidian table. 12 seats for the 12 voices that theoretically governed the empire alongside the crown. In practice, 6 of those voices said whatever Thorne wanted to hear, 3 said whatever they calculated would advance their position, 2 genuinely attempted honest counsel, and 1 belonged to Lucian Draxon. Thorne entered last. He always entered last. The psychology was elementary but effective. Whoever controlled the timing of an entrance controlled the emotional temperature of the room. Arrive early, and you waited for others, ceding psychological ground. Arrive simultaneously, and you were one of many. Arrive last, and every head turned, every conversation paused, and the room reorganized itself around your presence like iron filings around a magnet. He sat. He did not speak. The silence lasted long enough for the council members to begin glancing at each other. Lord Varen cleared his throat. Lady Marin Dramora adjusted her papers. Lord Cassian Forge, master of the Imperial Treasury, tapped his ring against the table once before catching himself and stopping. And Lucian Draxon sat perfectly still. His posture was immaculate. His expression was the neutral, pleasantly attentive mask of a man who had spent his entire career ensuring that his face never revealed anything his mouth had not authorized. Here was the thing about men like Lucien that most people failed to understand. They were not evil in the theatrical sense. They did not cackle in dark rooms or monologue about their schemes. They were something far more dangerous than evil. They were competent. They understood systems. They understood leverage. They understood the precise amount of pressure required to bend an institution without breaking it, to redirect resources without triggering alarms, to accumulate power so gradually that by the time anyone noticed, the accumulation had become irreversible. Lucian was not a villain. He was an engineer, and the machine he was building ran on other people's trust. Thorne understood this because he recognized the methodology. He had used variations of it himself during his early years on the throne, consolidating power not through force, but through the patient, systematic replacement of uncertainty with obligation. The difference was that Thorne had used those tools to build an empire. Lucien was using them to steal one. "Gentlemen, Lady Dramora." Thorne's voice filled the chamber the way water filled a glass, completely, leaving no room for anything else. The western provinces are in crisis. Famine has killed more citizens in the past 3 months than the border wars killed in 3 years. I have personally inspected the conditions. They are unacceptable. He paused. Let the words settle. Lord Kren, the regional administrator of the Western Territories, has been arrested. The charges are theft, falsification of imperial records, and dereliction of duty resulting in civilian deaths. Lucian's expression did not change. Not a twitch, not a flicker. That was how Thorne knew the information had hit its target. A man who genuinely felt nothing about an ally's arrest would have shown casual concern. A man who showed absolutely nothing was actively suppressing a reaction. Kren was appointed through standard administrative channels, Lucian said calmly. His record showed no prior concerns. His record was fabricated. The audits that cleared him were conducted by officials who reported directly to his office. The system reviewed itself and found no problems. I am shocked. Lord Varen coughed. Lady Dramora studied her papers with sudden intensity. Lucien smiled. It was a small professional smile, the kind that communicated cooperation without committing to anything. Your Majesty, if there are systemic failures in our appointment process, I would welcome a full review. Transparency strengthens governance. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. The man whose network had installed Kren was now volunteering to lead the investigation into Kren's corruption. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of an arsonist offering to join the fire brigade. Thorne leaned forward, just slightly, an inch at most. But in the geometry of power, an inch of forward lean from a king was the equivalent of a drawn sword. I agree, Chancellor, which is why I am appointing an independent commission to audit every administrative appointment made in the past 3 years. The commission will report directly to me, not to this council, not to your office, to me. The room temperature dropped by several degrees. Not literally. but the kind of cold that filled a space when powerful people realized the ground beneath them was shifting. Lucien's smile held, but his eyes changed. The warmth drained from them like water from a cracked vessel, and what remained was something flat and calculating and briefly, for just a fraction of a second, afraid. Of course, Your Majesty. Whatever serves the Empire. I am glad we agree. And there it was. The thing about confrontations between intelligent adversaries. They never looked like confrontations. They looked like polite conversations where every word carried the weight of a concealed weapon and every pause was a battlefield. Thorne dismissed the council. Lucien rose with the others, gathered his documents, and exited with the measured stride of a man who refused to appear hurried, even when the building was on fire around him. Kael remained behind. He knows you know, Kael said. He suspects I know. There's a difference. Suspicion makes men cautious. Certainty makes them desperate. I need him cautious, not desperate. Not yet. And when yet arrives, I will need you standing where you always stand. Beside you. Between me and whatever comes through the door. Kael nodded. It was a soldier's nod. No drama. No sentiment. Just the quiet confirmation of a man who understood that some promises did not require eloquence. The philosopher inside every warrior understood a truth that comfortable men never learned. There was no such thing as controlled confrontation. You could plan. You could prepare. You could position assets and calculate probabilities and rehearse responses until your jaw ached. But the moment the confrontation actually began, control became an illusion, and what remained was instinct, training, and the willingness to absorb damage while still moving forward. Thorne spent the following days absorbing damage. The independent commission began its work and immediately encountered resistance. Records disappeared from archives. Officials developed sudden illnesses that prevented them from testifying. 2 clerks who had been cooperative in initial interviews were found reassigned to remote posts before they could provide formal statements. Lucien's network was defending itself. Not overtly. Never overtly. The resistance was subtle, institutional, woven into the bureaucratic fabric so deeply that isolating it would require dismantling half the administrative apparatus of the empire. And while Thorne fought this invisible war, Celine made her move. She appeared at his chambers on the 7th night after his return. He had not spoken to her since the conclave. They had occupied the same palace, attended the same functions, nodded at each other across rooms filled with people who pretended not to notice the Arctic distance between their king and empress. But they had not exchanged private words. Until now. She entered without knocking. That alone was a statement. Doors were boundaries, and ignoring them was a declaration that the person behind them did not have the authority to exclude you. Thorne stood at his desk, reviewing commission reports by candlelight. He did not look up immediately. Another statement. I heard you enter. I choose not to acknowledge it. Your presence does not reorganize my priorities. The games powerful people played with silence and attention were exhausting, and both of them were experts. Thorne. He looked up. Celine stood in the doorway wearing a dark gown that caught the candlelight and held it the way a trap holds prey, beautifully and without mercy. Her face was composed. Her eyes were clear. She looked like a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times and had arrived prepared for every possible variation. There was a particular kind of sadness in seeing someone you once loved standing before you in full armor. Not metal armor, emotional armor. The kind constructed from years of disappointment, reinforced with resentment, and polished until it looked like elegance. Celine, we need to talk. We have needed to talk for approximately 2 years. Your timing is interesting. She crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite his desk without being invited. Another boundary ignored. Another declaration. The commission you appointed is causing panic among the noble houses. Good. Panic is the appropriate response to discovering that your officials have been stealing from starving citizens. That is not why they are panicking, and you know it. They are panicking because an independent commission with direct royal authority can investigate anyone, including houses that have done nothing wrong but have enough skeletons in their records to make the process uncomfortable. Everyone has skeletons, Celine. That is not a reason to stop looking. It is a reason to be strategic about how you look. You're alienating allies. Allies who tolerate corruption are not allies. They are co-conspirators with good table manners. She studied him. Her expression shifted, just barely, the way a landscape shifted when a cloud moved across the sun. The change was subtle but total. You have changed. People change. It is generally considered a sign of life. I am serious, Thorne. Something happened in the West. You left angry and came back something else. I left focused and came back informed. The distinction matters. What did you find out there? Starvation, corruption, people dying inside an empire wealthy enough to prevent it. And what? The reports say you spent considerable time with a local steward, a woman, Seraphine Mora. The name in Celine's mouth felt wrong, like hearing a clean word pronounced by someone whose intentions made it dirty. Not because Celine's voice carried malice, it carried something worse. Strategy. She was not asking about Seraphine out of jealousy. She was asking because Seraphine was a potential weapon, and Celine was assessing its caliber. She showed me evidence of systematic theft in the western provinces, evidence that led directly to officials appointed through the chancellor's network. Do not deflect. I am asking about the woman, not the politics. In my experience, the two are never separate. Celine leaned back. The candlelight caught her eyes and made them look like something burning behind glass. Let me be direct since you insist on being oblique. You have spent 11 days in the company of a woman who is not your wife, in a remote province, beyond the oversight of court and council. You have returned and immediately launched a political offensive against the administrative network that happens to support the people closest to me. I am not a fool, Thorne. Connect the dots for me, or I will connect them myself, and my version will be less flattering than yours. The audacity was breathtaking. She was standing in his study, the woman he had watched kissing another man in the Eastern Gallery, and she was accusing him of impropriety. The old Thorne, the Thorne of 6 months ago, would have erupted, would have thrown the truth of what he saw at the conclave into her face like acid and watched the composure dissolve. But the man who had sat beside mountain fires and listened to a woman in muddy boots talk about feeding hungry children had learned something about the difference between reaction and response. Reaction was immediate. It felt powerful, but accomplished nothing except the brief, addictive satisfaction of releasing pressure. Response was deliberate. It cost more, it took longer, and it actually changed the outcome. Celine. His voice was level, not calm. Level. Calm implied peace. Level implied control. The difference was the difference between a still lake and a frozen one. One was safe. The other was dangerous because you could not see what moved beneath the surface. I know about Lucienne. 3 words that detonated the entire conversation. She did not flinch. He gave her that. Years of court training had built reflexes that could suppress visible reaction faster than most people could blink. But the suppression itself was visible to someone who knew what to look for. The slight dilation of the pupils, the momentary pause in breathing, the almost imperceptible tightening of the tendons in her neck. You know what exactly? I know about the Eastern Gallery during the conclave. I know about the correspondence routed through unmarked channels. I know about the envoys to Castavar. And I know that whatever this started as, it is no longer about passion. It is about succession. The room held its breath. The candle flames leaned sideways as if flinching from the temperature of the silence. Celine sat very still. The armor she wore, the emotional armor, the years of carefully constructed composure, was being tested at its seams. How long have you known? Long enough? Then why did you say nothing? Because a king who reacts to betrayal in public destroys his empire in the process. Because the moment I confronted you, the alliance with House Valor would fracture, and every vulture on every border would smell blood. Because the cost of honesty was higher than the cost of silence, and I chose the option that kept the most people alive. So you suffered quietly. I governed effectively. There is a difference. Is there? The question echoed something Seraphine had asked him by firelight in the mountains. The same words, entirely different intent. Seraphine had asked because she genuinely wanted to understand the man behind the crown. Celine asked because she was searching for a weakness to exploit. The difference between those two motivations was the difference between a hand extended to help and a hand reaching for a knife. You have 2 choices, Celine. We can address this privately, between ourselves, and negotiate a resolution that preserves the stability of the empire. Or you can continue on your current path, and I will be forced to respond as a king, rather than as a husband. I am offering you the first option because despite everything, I believe you once cared about this empire as much as I do. Once. The word was chosen deliberately. She stood. The movement was fluid, controlled. A woman who understood that even the act of standing up could be choreographed for maximum effect. You think you are offering me a choice. You are offering me a cage with two doors. Behind one door is submission. Behind the other is war. Neither door leads to freedom. Freedom. He tasted the word. You are the Empress of Vareth. You command resources most people cannot imagine. You live in a palace built from the labor of 1 million citizens. What freedom are you lacking exactly? The freedom to be something other than your political asset. You stopped being my political asset when you started sleeping with my chancellor. The words hit open air and stayed there, raw and unretractable, and carrying the kind of truth that once spoken could never be unspoken. Celine's composure cracked, not completely, not the dramatic collapse of a woman undone by confrontation. It was smaller than that and more devastating. A hairline fracture running through the mask, visible only in the slight tremor at the corner of her mouth, and the brightness that gathered in her eyes without falling. We stopped being husband and wife years ago, Thorne. Yes, but you could have told me that before you found someone else to replace me. Would it have mattered? We will never know. She moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. You asked about Seraphine Mora. You asked about her. I answered. You answered about politics. I'm asking about something else. Then ask clearly. Do you love her? The question hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. And Thorne, who had answered 10,000 questions from 10,000 people without hesitation, found himself unable to speak. Not because he did not know the answer, because saying it aloud would make it real. And real things could be lost. Real things could be taken. Real things could be used as leverage by people who understood that the most effective way to control a powerful man was to threaten the thing he actually cared about. Good night, Celine. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, layered with so many competing emotions that the surface showed nothing, like deep water that appeared still because the currents were too far below to disturb the surface. Then she left. And Thorne sat alone in candlelight and understood with terrible clarity that the conversation had not been a negotiation. It had been a reconnaissance mission. Celine had come to determine his position, his knowledge, and his vulnerabilities. She had left with exactly the information she needed, not confirmation of the affair. She already knew he knew. What she had gained was something far more valuable. She had seen his face when she asked about Seraphine, and in the fraction of a second before he controlled his expression, she had seen the answer he refused to speak. That answer was now a weapon. And Celine Vialor had never been a woman who left weapons unused. The weeks that followed moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier consuming a valley. On the surface, life at Hollowspire continued its elaborate performance. Councils met. Edicts were issued. The machinery of empire churned through winter, with the mechanical indifference of a system designed to function, regardless of whether the people operating it were loyal or treacherous. Beneath the surface, everything was fracturing. Thorne's commission uncovered systematic corruption across 4 provinces. Dozens of officials were removed, some cooperated, most resisted. The resistance was quiet but pervasive: delayed documents, misfiled reports, witnesses who changed their testimony between interviews, the slow institutional sabotage of an apparatus protecting itself. And Celine was everywhere. Not visibly, not obviously. She attended court functions with perfect poise. She smiled at the right people. She said the right things. But Kael's network tracked her private communications, and the picture they assembled was damning. She had secured preliminary support from House Valor's military commanders. She had opened dialogue with 3 eastern houses through intermediaries, and she had sent a personal letter to Lady Blackshore, the contents of which Kael's agents had been unable to intercept. The Navy. Always the Navy. If Isolde Blackshore turned, the calculus of the entire conflict changed. Ground wars could be won with superior numbers and better positioning, but a hostile navy could blockade ports, starve coastal cities, and cut the empire's economic arteries faster than any land army could march. Thorne summoned Isolde. She arrived at the war room at midnight, as requested. She wore no ceremonial clothing, just a naval officer's coat over practical trousers and boots that had seen actual salt water. She sat across from Thorne and Kyle and looked at them with the steady, appraising gaze of a woman who commanded warships and did not appreciate having her time wasted. Your Majesty, General, this is either very important or very dramatic. I am hoping for the former. Selene has approached you, Thorne said. No preamble, no diplomatic cushioning. Sometimes the most effective strategy was the absence of strategy. Isolde did not deny it. She has. What did she offer? Autonomy. Full naval independence from imperial oversight. My fleet, my command structure, my budget. No council approval required for deployments. And the price. Neutrality. If things between you and Selene escalate, she wants my ships out of the equation. Neutrality is not neutral when one side depends on naval support and the other does not. I'm aware of the mathematics, Your Majesty. Kale leaned forward. If you pull the Navy, the coastal provinces lose their primary defense. Any foreign power, Castavar included, could land troops on the Sunder Coast within weeks. I am also aware of that mathematics, General. Thorne studied her. Isolde Blackshore was many things. Ambitious, yes. Self-interested, certainly. But she was also the granddaughter of an admiral who had died defending the very coastline that was now at risk. Her loyalty was not to Thorne personally, it was to the Empire's survival. The question was which path she believed led to that survival. Isolde, I'm not going to offer you a counterdeal. I'm not going to promise you autonomy or resources or whatever currency Selene used. I'm going to tell you the truth, which is something you will not get from the other side. I am listening. The Empire is being eaten from the inside. Not by enemies, by its own officials. 60% of Western grain supplies were stolen by administrators appointed through Lucien's network. People died. Children starved. And the system that was supposed to prevent it had been converted into the mechanism that enabled it. I'm trying to fix that. Selene and Lucien are trying to stop me from fixing it because the system I am dismantling is the system that funds their power base. He paused. Let the information settle. If you pull the Navy, you are not choosing neutrality. You are choosing to let the people who built that system continue operating it. And the next time children starve in the Western provinces, or the Eastern provinces, or any province that has the misfortune of being governed by men who view citizens as resources to be extracted, you will know that you had the power to prevent it and chose not to. The room was silent. Isolde looked at Thorne for a long time. Her expression carried the particular intensity of a person recalculating a position they had already tentatively decided. You play dirty, Your Majesty. I play honest. In politics, they look the same. If I support you and you fall, my fleet burns. If you support them and they win, your fleet becomes their fleet. And Lucien Draxon is not a man who shares power with anyone he cannot control. She exhaled slowly. It was the sound of a woman who had just watched a door close behind her. I need time. You have 3 weeks. After that, the situation will have moved beyond the point where time is useful. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She stood, straightened her coat, moved toward the door. Your Majesty. Yes. The woman in the west, the steward. Thorne's jaw tightened. If you want my support, you need to understand something. Selene is not just building a political case against you. She is building a narrative. The narrative is that the king has abandoned his duty for a common woman. True or not, that narrative has power. And if you do not address it, it will be addressed for you. She left. Kale looked at Thorne. She is right. I know she is right. Then what are you going to do about it? I do not know. It was the most honest answer he had given anyone in weeks. And the honesty terrified him because it meant the one area of his life where clarity mattered most was the one area where he had none. On a frozen night 3 days later, Thorne rode out of Hollowspire alone. No escort, no banners, no entourage. He left through the postern gate after midnight, cloaked and anonymous, riding west on a horse chosen for endurance rather than appearance. Kyle knew. No one else did. The ride took 4 days. He pushed hard through mountain passes still choked with snow, through valleys where the wind cut like a blade forged from pure cold, through forests so dense that daylight filtered through the canopy in narrow shafts that looked like the bars of a cage designed by nature itself. He arrived at Ashen Hollow at dusk on the fourth day. The estate was exactly as he remembered. A cluster of stone buildings set against the mountainside, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of livestock and distant hammering, and the particular quiet that belonged to places where people worked too hard to waste energy on noise. Seraphine was in the lower field, mending a fence that had collapsed under the weight of ice. She wore the same heavy coat, the same muddy boots. Her hands were raw from cold and labor, and when she saw him dismount at the edge of the field, she straightened slowly, like a woman who had learned not to trust good news that arrived without warning. He walked toward her across frozen ground. She watched him approach. Neither spoke until he was close enough that their breath mingled in the cold air between them. "You came back," she said. "I came back." "Why?" He looked at her, the mountains behind her, the darkening sky, the absolute terrifying simplicity of a woman who asked questions she actually wanted answered. "Because everything in my empire is falling apart. Because my wife is conspiring with my chancellor to destroy me. Because I have a war coming that I may not win, and an investigation that is being sabotaged from the inside, and a Navy commander who has not decided whether to support me or watch me burn." "That does not answer my question." "Because you are the only person in my entire life who has never wanted anything from me except the truth." She held his gaze. The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the valley, a dog barked twice and fell silent. "Come inside," she said. "You look like a man who has not eaten in 4 days." 3. "That is not the improvement you think it is." They sat in her kitchen, a room that smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs, and the kind of warmth that came from a space that had been lived in rather than decorated. She fed him stew made from whatever the valley had provided, tough and oversalted and more satisfying than any banquet he had attended in a decade. They talked for hours. He told her everything: the commission, the resistance, Celine's reconnaissance visit, Isolde's ultimatum, the narrative being built against him. He held nothing back. Not because he trusted her strategically, because he was tired of holding things back, and she was the only person who had ever made honesty feel safe. She listened with the same intensity she brought to everything. No interruption, no judgment, just the focused attention of someone who believed that listening was not passive, but was the most active thing one person could do for another. When he finished, the fire had burned low and the kitchen had grown cold around its edges. "You are here because you want me to tell you what to do," she said. "No." "Then why?" "Because I need to be in the same room as someone who sees me as a person instead of a position. For one night, before I go back and become the position again." "You think those are separate things?" "They have to be." "Why?" "Because if they are not, then the position consumes the person, and there is nothing left." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were rough and calloused and warm from the fire. They closed around his with a firmness that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the simple, radical act of one human being refusing to let another disappear into their own isolation. "You are not nothing, Thorne. You are a man sitting in my kitchen eating bad stew and telling the truth for the first time in years. That is not nothing. That is the most important thing I have ever seen." He looked at their joined hands, at her face across the table, at the small, imperfect, utterly real life she had built in these mountains, a life without crowns or conspiracies or the constant, exhausting performance of power. And he wanted it. Not as a fantasy, not as an escape. He wanted it the way a drowning man wanted air, with the desperate biological urgency of a body that understood it was dying and reached for survival without consulting the mind. He stood, she stood with him. The table between them was narrow and old and scarred from years of meals and ledgers and the daily work of keeping people alive. He moved around it. She did not step back. When he kissed her, it was not like the kiss he had witnessed in the Eastern Gallery. Not practiced, not confident. Not the polished gesture of two people who had rehearsed their betrayal until it looked like passion. It was clumsy and desperate and tasted like salt and wood smoke and something ancient that had no name because language had not yet been invented when humans first reached for each other in the dark. She kissed him back, and in that moment, standing in a cold kitchen in a forgotten valley in the most remote corner of his own empire, the king of Vareth crossed a line that no amount of power, strategy, or sovereign authority could uncross. He was still married. His empire was still fracturing. His enemies were still circling. and he had just handed them the weapon they needed to destroy him. Because the most dangerous thing a king could do was not wage war, or challenge rivals, or dismantle corrupt systems. The most dangerous thing a king could do was fall in love with someone who made him realize the crown was killing him, and then go back to wearing it anyway. In the gray light of dawn, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge above Ashen Hollow. The horse was lathered and trembling, ridden hard through mountain passes that should have taken days but had been covered in 2. Thorne was standing in the doorway of Seraphine's house when the rider descended. The message was from Kael. 2 lines. Celine has declared the marriage dissolved before the southern houses. She is naming herself regent and calling you unfit. The armies are moving. Thorne read the words twice. Then he looked back into the kitchen where Seraphine stood watching him, and he saw on her face the quiet understanding of a woman who already knew what the letter said before he spoke. "Go," she whispered. He folded the message, tucked it inside his coat, and rode east into a war he had spent months trying to prevent, carrying inside his chest the weight of something he had spent his entire life pretending he did not need, leaving it behind in a mountain valley with a woman he might never see again. The crown was calling, and this time it sounded like a death sentence. The horse nearly died beneath him on the 3rd day. He felt the animal's rhythm break somewhere in the Grey March Pass, a stuttering collapse in the hindquarters that sent the beast stumbling across loose shale. Thorne dismounted immediately, his boots hitting frozen rock, his hands running along the horse's flank where muscle trembled like something trying to hold together after the scaffolding had already failed. The animal's breath came in ragged plumes, its eyes rolled white at the edges. He had ridden the creature beyond its limits because he was riding beyond his own, and animals understood what men refused to admit, that the body had boundaries the will could not overrule forever. He walked the horse for 2 miles through the pass until they reached a relay station carved into the mountainside. Imperial way stations dotted the major routes, small stone shelters stocked with grain and water for military couriers. Thorne commandeered a fresh mount from the station keeper, a wiry man who recognized the king and nearly collapsed from the shock of seeing him alone, uncloaked, with mud on his face and desperation in his posture. "Your Majesty, where's your escort?" "Behind me, ahead of me, everywhere except where I need them." He mounted the fresh horse and rode east before the man could form another question. The landscape changed as he descended from the mountains. The frozen whites and grays of the western highlands gave way to the darker earth of the central plains, where winter had loosened its grip just enough to turn the ground into a churned mixture of mud and dead grass. The sky hung low and iron-colored, pressing down on the world with the flat indifference of weather that did not care about the affairs of kings. Thorne rode and thought, not strategically, not tactically. He thought the way a man thought when the architecture of his life had been demolished, and he was standing in the rubble trying to determine which pieces were load-bearing and which had only looked important. Celine had declared the marriage dissolved, not through the imperial courts, not through the traditional channels that required mutual consent and council arbitration. She had declared it unilaterally before the southern houses, which meant she had invoked the ancient right of sovereign severance, a legal mechanism so old and so rarely used that most scholars considered it ceremonial rather than functional. The right allowed an empress to dissolve her marriage if she could demonstrate before 3 or more noble houses that the king had abandoned his sovereign obligations. It was a law designed for situations where a monarch had gone mad, or disappeared or been captured by foreign enemies. It was never intended for political maneuvering. But Celine was not interested in what laws were intended for. She was interested in what they could be made to do. By declaring the marriage dissolved, she accomplished 3 things simultaneously. First, she freed herself from any legal obligation to the crown, which meant her actions could no longer be classified as treason against a spouse. Second, she positioned herself as regent, a transitional authority claiming to act in the empire's interest during a period of royal instability. Third, and most critically, she transformed the narrative from a wife betraying her husband into a patriot, rescuing her empire from an unfit king. It was brilliant, it was devastating, and it was built on a foundation of lies so carefully constructed that dismantling them would require Thorne to expose truths that might destroy him in the process. There is a specific kind of despair reserved for men who see the trap closing and understand every mechanism of its design but lack the time or position to disarm it. It is not the despair of ignorance. It is the despair of comprehension. Knowing exactly how you are being destroyed and being unable to stop it because the destruction is happening faster than your ability to respond. Thorne felt that despair settling into his bones as he rode. It was heavier than exhaustion, heavier than the crown he had left behind in Hollowspire. It was the weight of a man realizing that the greatest threat to his survival had never been foreign armies or political rivals, or even the chancellor who slept with his wife. The greatest threat had always been his own reluctance to believe that the people closest to him were capable of what they were doing. That was the fatal flaw of every powerful man who still carried some residual fragment of trust inside his chest. Not naivety. Thorne was never naive, but the stubborn, irrational refusal to fully accept that someone who had shared his bed, his counsel, his crown, could look at everything they had built together and decide it was worth less than the power they could seize by tearing it apart. He had known about the affair for months. He had known about the conspiracy for weeks. He had gathered evidence, positioned assets, planned responses. And still, some part of him, some buried, unarmored piece of the man beneath the king, had held on to the belief that it would not actually come to this, that Celine would pull back, that Lucien would overreach and expose himself, that the system would correct before it collapsed. That belief was gone now, and its absence left a void that felt less like emptiness and more like clarity. The terrible, surgical clarity of a man who finally understood that survival required him to stop being the person he had been and become someone he was not sure he could live with. He reached the outskirts of the capital on the evening of the fourth day. Hollowspire looked different from the eastern approach. The citadel rose against the darkening sky like a fist of black stone, its towers crowned with the iron banners that had flown since the founding of the Valerius dynasty. But tonight the banners were wrong. Half of them had been replaced. The black and silver of House Valerius still flew from the central towers, but the southern battlements now carried the crimson of House Valor, Celine's colors. On his walls, Thorne stopped his horse on a ridge overlooking the city. Below him, the streets were not burning. There were no barricades, no armies clashing in the squares, no visible signs of the violent upheaval he had feared during the ride. The capital looked almost normal, merchants closing shops for the evening, lanterns being lit along the main thoroughfares, the quiet bustle of a city settling into its nightly routine. That was worse than fire. Fire meant open conflict. Open conflict could be met with force. But this calm, orderly transition of power, this quiet replacement of one set of banners with another, while the population continued their daily lives as if nothing fundamental had changed, this was the most dangerous kind of coup. The kind that did not look like a coup at all. Kael met him at the postern gate. The general was armed, not ceremonially, armed the way a man armed himself when he expected to use every weapon he carried before the night was over. Report. Kael spoke as they moved through the narrow service corridors beneath the palace. These passages were older than the current structure, carved from the bedrock during an era when kings needed escape routes more than ballrooms. The air was cold and damp and smelled like centuries of stone and secrecy. Celine arrived at the capital 2 days ago with a contingent from House Valor, 1,200 soldiers. They entered through the southern gate under the pretense of a diplomatic escort. Once inside, they secured the southern quarter of the palace and the administrative wing. The administrative wing. The imperial archives, the treasury records, the commission files. Thorne stopped walking. The commission files. Months of evidence documenting corruption across 4 provinces. Names, dates, transactions, the entire paper trail connecting Lucien's network to systematic theft. If Celine controlled those files, she controlled the evidence, and whoever controlled the evidence controlled the narrative. Are the files intact? Unknown. My people were removed from the administrative wing before I could verify. The clerks who were cooperating with the commission have been relocated. I do not know where. Thorne pressed his hand against the stone wall. The cold seeped through his skin. He stood there for a moment, breathing, processing, forcing his mind to function analytically when every instinct was screaming at him to react, to charge into the palace and reclaim what was his through the sheer force of will that had sustained him through every crisis of his reign. But instinct was a luxury he could no longer afford. Where is Lucien? Back at court. He returned the same day Celine arrived. He has been operating from the chancellor's office as if nothing has changed, issuing administrative orders under Celine's regency authority. And the council? Split. Varen and Dremora are supporting Celine. Cassian Forge is hedging. The rest are waiting to see which direction the wind settles before committing. Blackshore. Kael hesitated. That hesitation told Thorne everything he needed to know, but he needed to hear it spoken because some truths required the violence of language to become fully real. Isolde pulled the Navy to neutral anchorage off the Sunder Coast 3 days ago. She is not supporting Celine, but she is not supporting you either. Neutral. The word tasted like ash. Isolde had chosen the one position that felt principled but functioned as abandonment. By pulling to neutral, she avoided the appearance of betrayal while delivering its practical effect. Without the Navy, Thorne could not enforce coastal authority. Without coastal authority, trade revenues would be disrupted. Without trade revenues, he could not fund a prolonged military response even if he wanted one. Checkmate in 3 moves, and every move had been made before he even reached the board. How many loyal soldiers do I have inside the city? 3,000, maybe 3,500. The palace guard is mostly intact, but the outer garrisons are confused. They received conflicting orders, some from your commanders, some from Celine's regency office. Most are staying in barracks waiting for clarity. Clarity. Thorne almost laughed. Almost. The sound died in his throat before it fully formed. The entire empire is collapsing into a power vacuum, and the military is waiting for clarity. They're waiting for a king to act like a king, Thorne. The use of his name again. Kael only did that when the situation had moved beyond protocol into the territory of last stands and desperate measures. They emerged from the service corridors into the private wing of the palace. Thorne's chambers were untouched. Celine had not been reckless enough to occupy the king's personal quarters. That would have been a step too far, too visible, too easily characterized as usurpation rather than regency. She understood that the difference between a political maneuver and a crime was often just a matter of which rooms you entered. Thorne stood in his study. The same desk, the same chair, the same maps on the walls showing an empire that was technically still his, but practically slipping through his fingers like water through a cracked vessel. "Bring me Lord Cassian Forge." Kael raised an eyebrow. "The treasurer. The treasurer controls the imperial purse. Whoever controls the purse controls the army. Celine knows this, which is why she has not moved against him yet. She needs him compliant, not conquered. That means he is still in play. And if he has already committed to her, then we are having a very different conversation." Kael left. Thorne stood alone in the study and did something he had not done in years. He removed the crown, not symbolically, physically. He reached up, lifted the iron circlet from his head, and set it on the desk. It sat there on the dark wood, a circle of cold metal, lighter than it felt when worn, smaller than it seemed when feared. He stared at it. 20 years. 20 years of wearing that weight. 20 years of decisions that killed some people and saved others, and left him unable to sleep because the mathematics of governance meant that every choice was a trade, every victory was someone else's defeat, and every morning brought a new set of problems that could not be solved without creating new problems in their wake. And now the woman he had married to end a war was starting a new one. The man he had trusted to manage his empire had been dismantling it from within. The allies he had counted on were calculating whether loyalty was still a profitable investment, and the only person in the world who made him feel like something other than a weapon wearing a crown was 200 miles away in a mountain valley, mending fences and feeding people who would never know that their steward had kissed a king in a cold kitchen and changed the trajectory of an empire. Lord Cassian Forge arrived within the hour. He was a small man in the physical sense, narrow-shouldered and thin, with the kind of body that suggested he had been built for speed rather than strength, and then spent his adult life sitting behind desks until even the speed was gone. But his mind was anything but small. Cassian Forge had managed the imperial treasury for 11 years, navigating financial crises, funding wars, balancing budgets that would have broken lesser accountants, and emerging from each challenge with the smug satisfaction of a man who understood that numbers were the only honest language in politics. He sat across from Thorne and looked at the crown on the desk between them. "Interesting decorating choice, Your Majesty. Save the wit, Cassian. I need the mathematician. The mathematician has been running calculations for 3 days and does not like the results." "Tell me the results you do not like." Celine controls the Southern Treasury reserves through House Valor. That is roughly 30% of the empire's liquid wealth. Lucien has been quietly redirecting administrative funds into accounts that are technically legal but practically untraceable. I estimate another 15%. Combined with the disruption to trade revenues caused by Blackshore's naval withdrawal, you are looking at a functional treasury that is about half of what it should be. Half. Generous estimate. Could be worse. I have not been able to audit the Eastern accounts because the administrative wing is currently occupied by people who do not answer my requests. Thorne absorbed this. Half a treasury, half an army, half an empire. Everything he had built, halved by the people he had trusted to help him build it. Where do you stand, Cassian? The treasurer looked at him. There was no calculation in his eyes this time, no hedging, just the tired honesty of a man who had been running numbers long enough to know that some equations had no good solutions. I stand where I have always stood, with the numbers. And the numbers say that Celine's regency is built on stolen funds and forged authority. It will collapse under its own financial weight within 6 months, but 6 months is long enough to do irreparable damage to the empire's economic infrastructure. So time is against us. Time is against everyone. The question is who runs out first. Can you freeze the accounts Lucien has been redirecting? I can freeze some. The rest are layered through intermediaries that will take weeks to untangle. But if I start freezing accounts tonight, Lucien will know by morning, and he will accelerate whatever he is planning. He is already accelerating. Then we are in a race against a man who has a head start. Thorne picked up the crown, held it in his hands, turned it slowly, feeling the cold iron against his palms, the weight of it, the simplicity of its construction. No jewels, no gold, just iron forged from chains. A reminder that power was not luxury, power was burden. Start freezing everything you can reach, tonight, now. That will provoke a response. Everything provokes a response. I am done waiting for responses. I am going to start causing them. Cassian stood. He paused at the door. Your Majesty, for what it is worth, Lucien approached me 6 weeks ago. Offered me a position in Celine's new administration, Treasury Minister with expanded authority. What did you tell him? I told him I would think about it. And did you? I did. I thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. Then I thought about the fact that Lucien has been stealing from the empire I have spent 11 years keeping solvent, and I decided that I would rather burn the treasury to the ground than hand it to a man who considers theft a management strategy. That is the most emotional thing I have ever heard you say. Do not get used to it. He left. Thorne placed the crown back on his head. It settled against his skull with the familiar cold pressure, and for a moment, just a moment, he closed his eyes and let himself feel all of it. The exhaustion, the betrayal, the fear, the loneliness, the impossible weight of being the one person everyone looked to for answers, while being the one person no one actually knew. Then he opened his eyes. And the man who opened them was not entirely the same man who had closed them. Something had shifted, not healed, not resolved, shifted, like a broken bone resetting. The process was agonizing, and the result was not the same as the original structure, but it was functional. It could bear weight. It could move. He summoned Kael. I need you to do something that I cannot order you to do. Kael waited. I need you to ride to Ashen Hollow, find Seraphine Mora, bring her to the capital. Thorne, this is not about what you think it is about. Then what is it about? Seraphine has 18 months of documented evidence proving systematic corruption in the western provinces. Names, dates, amounts, every official involved, every shipment diverted, every forged document. The commission files in the administrative wing may already be compromised. Seraphine's ledgers are the only independent record that exists outside Lucien's reach. Kyle stared at him. You want the evidence. I need the evidence. Without it, this becomes a he said, she said between a king and an empress, and the empire tears itself apart trying to decide who to believe. With it, I have proof. Documented, verified, independent proof that Lucien's network has been stealing from the empire. That changes the conversation from a marital dispute into a criminal prosecution. And the woman who carries this evidence. You want her brought into a capital that is currently occupied by people who consider her the symbol of everything wrong with your reign. I want her given the choice. bring the ledgers. Come to the capital if she is willing, but the choice is hers. Chael studied his king for a long time. The brazier light carved years into both their faces. You know what happens if she comes here. Selene will use her presence against you. The narrative writes itself. King abandons duty for a common woman, and now he is bringing her into the palace during a succession crisis. Every house on the fence will see it as confirmation. I know. And you are willing to accept that cost. The cost of not having that evidence is higher. Is it the evidence you need, Thorne, or is it her? The question hung between them, honest and brutal and impossible to answer without exposing something that Thorne had been protecting with every defense mechanism he possessed. Ride west, Chael, please. Chael held his gaze for 3 more heartbeats. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out. And Thorne stood alone in the war room of an empire that was crumbling around him, having just sent his most trusted ally away from the capital at the worst possible moment, knowing that the next 72 hours would determine whether he survived as king or fell as the man who loved too honestly in a world that punished honesty with annihilation. The crown pressed against his skull. He could feel his own pulse beneath the iron, fast, too fast. Because somewhere in the western mountains, a woman with muddy boots and a leather ledger was about to be pulled into a war she never asked for. And the man who loved her had just made her the most important piece on a chessboard where every square was soaked in blood. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Kings were not supposed to shake. But the man inside the king was no longer asking permission to exist, and that man was terrified, not of losing the empire, of losing her. The 72 hours that followed Chael's departure were the longest of Thorne's life, and he had once spent 4 days pinned behind enemy lines at the siege of Dunmarch, with an arrow shaft embedded in his left shoulder and nothing to drink but rainwater collected in a dead man's helmet. This was worse, because at Dunmarch, the enemy wore different colors and stood on the other side of a wall. Here, the enemy wore his own banners and sat in his own council chambers, and used his own laws to dismantle his authority with the patient, methodical precision of a surgeon removing organs from a body that was still conscious. Selene moved fast, faster than Thorne had anticipated, which meant she had been planning this phase long before he discovered the conspiracy. The Regency Declaration spread through the empire, carried by riders dispatched to every province simultaneously. The message was simple, calibrated for maximum impact with minimum complexity. The king has abandoned his duties. The empress acts in the empire's interest. All loyal houses are requested to acknowledge the transitional authority until stability is restored. The language was genius. Not queen, not ruler. Transitional authority. The phrasing suggested temporariness, reasonableness, the reluctant assumption of power by a woman who had no choice because the man who should have been governing was off chasing a commoner in the mountains. It was a narrative designed to make Selene look like a patriot and Thorne look like a fool, and the devastating part was that enough of it was true to make the lie stick. Thorne worked through those 3 days on something less than sleep and more than caffeine. He operated in the narrow corridor between exhaustion and adrenaline, that state where the body runs on something beyond physical fuel, something closer to sheer refusal to stop. He met with every loyal commander still inside the capital. He dispatched messages to houses he believed were undecided. He reviewed treasury movements with Cassian Forge, who had begun freezing accounts with the quiet fury of an accountant who had discovered someone cooking his books. And he waited for Chael. The waiting was the hardest part, not because of the uncertainty, because of what the uncertainty forced him to confront about his own motivations. He had told Chael the mission was about evidence, the ledgers, the documentation that would transform a political crisis into a criminal prosecution. And that was true. It was necessary. It was strategic. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that Thorne needed to know Seraphine was safe, that in the chaos of an empire tearing itself apart, the one person who had nothing to do with crowns or conspiracies or the ugly machinery of power was not going to be caught in the gears. He had brought her into his world by riding to Ashen Hollow, by sitting at her table, by kissing her in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke while an empire burned around them. And now the consequences of that choice were spreading outward like cracks in ice, and he could not predict where they would reach or what they would swallow. There was a truth about powerful men that biographers and historians consistently failed to capture. It was not that they feared nothing. Every powerful man feared something. The difference was that ordinary men could name their fears openly, could share them with wives and friends and brothers, could distribute the weight across the network of human connection that made fear survivable. Powerful men could not. Their fears were classified information, state secrets locked inside the vault of their own chests, because the moment a king admitted what he was afraid of losing, that thing became a target. Thorne had just made Seraphine a target, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing him from the inside out. On the morning of the third day, a messenger arrived from the southern approach. Not one of Kael's riders, one of Celine's. The man carried a sealed letter bearing the Valor crimson and delivered it with the stiff formality of someone who understood that being a messenger between warring spouses was approximately as safe as being a messenger between warring armies. Thorne read the letter in his study. Alone. It was from Celine. Handwritten, not dictated to a scribe. Her own hand, which he recognized from years of reading notes left on pillows, and tucked into books and slid across tables during councils so boring that even an empress needed someone to pass time with. The letter was short. Thorne, the armies of House Valor and the allied eastern houses will march on Hollowspire within the week. Lord Castevar's forces have crossed the Dremeren border and will reinforce our position from the west. This is not what I wanted. But you left me no alternative when you chose her over the Empire. Surrender the crown. Accept exile. And I will ensure no blood is spilled. This is my final offer. Celine. He read it 3 times. Not because the words were complicated, because he needed to feel the full weight of what they represented. His wife was offering him exile. His wife, the woman he had married to end a civil war, was now starting one and calling it his fault. She had invited a foreign military power onto imperial soil, given them territorial concessions in exchange for muscle, and framed the entire catastrophe as an act of patriotic necessity forced upon her by a king who could not keep his heart in his chest where it belonged. And the cruelest part, the part that sat in his stomach like a stone, was that she was partially right. He had chosen Seraphine, not over the Empire, but alongside it. He had allowed himself to feel something genuine in a world that punished genuineness with surgical precision. And now the bill was arriving, and the bill was denominated in soldiers and blood, and the possible collapse of everything he had spent his life building. Thorne burned the letter, watched the paper curl and blacken. Then he walked to the war room and did the thing he had been avoiding since the crisis began. He started planning for a battle he did not want to fight. The war room became his world. Maps covered every surface, troop positions marked in colored ink, supply lines drawn in charcoal. Defensive perimeters calculated with the mathematical precision that Cassian Forge brought to everything he touched. The numbers were bad. Celine's combined forces, House Valor, the allied eastern houses, and Castevar's foreign contingent outnumbered Thorne's loyal troops roughly 2-1. The advantage was not insurmountable in a defensive position, but Hollowspire was a palace, not a fortress. It had walls and towers and gates, but it was designed to project authority, not withstand a siege. Thorne studied the maps and saw what Celine expected him to see. A defensive position that was tenable for weeks, maybe months, but ultimately unsustainable. She was counting on a siege, counting on the slow strangulation of supply lines and morale that would force him to accept terms or watch his loyal soldiers starve behind walls that were never built to keep armies out. She expected him to play defense because that was what she had seen him do his entire reign. Absorb, endure, outlast, wait for the enemy to make a mistake and then exploit it with surgical precision. She expected patience, and 6 months ago she would have been right. But the man who had ridden west and sat beside mountain fires and been asked questions that no one else dared ask was not the same man who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of calculated restraint. Something had broken inside him when he kissed Seraphine in that kitchen. Or maybe something had been repaired. He could not tell the difference anymore, and maybe there was no difference. Maybe breaking and repairing were the same process experienced from different angles, like a bone that had to be rebroken before it could be set correctly. Whatever it was, it had changed how he saw the board. He was done waiting. On the 5th day after Kael's departure, with Celine's armies reportedly 3 days from the capital, Thorne assembled every loyal commander in the war room and did something that made half of them question his sanity. He announced that they were riding out to meet the enemy, not defending, not enduring, not waiting behind walls for the slow death of siege, riding out, in the open, against a force that outnumbered them. Commander Aldrich Voss, a veteran of the border wars with a face like carved granite and the diplomatic skills of a battering ram, spoke first. "Your Majesty, with respect, that is insane." "Noted. We have 3,000 soldiers. They have at least 6,000, possibly 7. Meeting them in the open is not a battle. It is a funeral. If we stay behind these walls, Commander, Selene besieges the capital, trade collapses, the civilian population begins to starve. And within 2 months, every undecided house in the empire concludes that the king who hid behind his own walls was not worth supporting. I lose the empire without a single sword being drawn. And if we ride out and lose, then I lose the empire with a sword in my hand, and the history is different." Voss stared at him. The room was silent. 15 commanders standing around a table covered in maps that showed their own destruction in precise geographic detail. "History is cold comfort to dead men, Your Majesty." "History is the only comfort anyone gets eventually, Commander. The question is what it says about you. There is a moment in every crisis when the rules change. Not gradually. Not through negotiation or evolution. They change the way a river changes course during a flood, suddenly, violently, and with complete indifference to whatever was standing in the previous path. The man who survives that moment is not the strongest or the smartest. He is the one who recognizes, faster than everyone around him, that the game he was playing no longer exists, and that clinging to its rules will kill him. Thorne recognized this. His commander saw a king making a reckless decision. What they did not see was a king who understood that the defensive game was already lost, that Selene had designed her entire strategy around the assumption that Thorne would behave predictably, and that the only move left was the one she had not planned for. Unpredictability, the last weapon of a man who has been outmaneuvered. The army rode out at dawn on the 6th day. 3,000 soldiers moving through the gates of Hollowspire in a column that stretched half a mile along the southern road. Infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks. Thorne at the front, mounted on a black warhorse that had been his father's last gift before the old king died. Wearing armor he had not worn since the border campaigns, carrying a sword he had not drawn in 5 years. The city watched them go. Citizens lined the streets in silence, not cheering, not protesting, silent, with the particular quiet of people who understood that they were witnessing something that would either save them or doom them, and who lacked the information to determine which. Thorne rode and felt the weight of their silence like a physical pressure against his back. Every face he passed was a life that depended on the decision he had made. Every child watching from a window was a future that might not exist if he was wrong. That was the burden no one talked about when they talked about leadership. Not the decisions themselves, the faces. The specific, individual, unrepeatable human faces that would bear the consequences. Generals moved colored pins on maps and calculated acceptable losses and spoke in percentages and probabilities. But percentages did not have mothers. Probabilities did not have names. Thorne knew this, had always known it, and carried it anyway because someone had to, and the crown on his head said he was the one. They made camp that night on the plains south of Hollowspire, on a stretch of flat ground bordered by low hills to the east and a river to the west. The position was deliberate. The hills provided observation points. The river prevented flanking from one side. And the open ground to the south meant that when Selene's army arrived, they would see Thorne's forces waiting for them, assembled and ready, and would have to make the conscious decision to attack a king standing on his own soil. That visual mattered, not militarily, psychologically. Selene's narrative depended on the image of a king who had abandoned his post. By riding out and standing in the path of her army, Thorne shattered that narrative with his physical presence. He was not hiding. He was not running. He was standing exactly where a king should stand between his people and the threat. Let her explain to the empire why she marched an army against a king who came out to meet her. Night fell. Campfires dotted the plain like earthbound stars. Thorne walked among his soldiers, not making speeches, not rallying morale with grand words and dramatic gestures. Just walking, being present, letting them see a king who was not above them or behind them, but among them, sharing the same cold ground in the same uncertain darkness. He found Commander Voss sharpening a sword by a fire near the eastern perimeter. "Still think I am insane, Commander?" Voss looked up. His face was all shadow and firelight. "More than ever, Your Majesty." "Good. Sane decisions have not been working." "That is the most disturbing thing a king has ever said to me." "Stay close tomorrow. I suspect it gets worse." Voss almost smiled. Almost. Thorne walked to the edge of camp and stood looking south. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Celene's army was moving toward him. Thousands of soldiers marching under crimson banners, carrying weapons forged to end his reign, led by a woman who had once slept beside him and was now prepared to bury him. And somewhere behind him, to the west, Kael was either riding hard toward the capital with Seraphine and the evidence that could change everything, or he was not, and Thorne would face whatever came next without either of them. The wind picked up, cold, carrying the smell of wet earth and distant rain. Storm weather, the kind of weather that made battlefields into mud and turned organized formations into struggling masses of men fighting the ground as much as each other. Thorne stood in that wind and felt something settle inside him. Not peace, not calm, something harder than both. Resolve. The cold, clear, unwavering understanding that he had made his choice and that whatever came next, retreat was no longer among the options. He had ridden out because defense was death. He had ridden out because Selene expected him to hide. But underneath those strategic justifications, beneath the tactical logic and the political calculation, there was a simpler truth. A truth that had nothing to do with empires or armies or the ruthless mathematics of power. He had ridden out because Seraphine had asked him a question in a mountain valley months ago, and he had finally found the answer. Are you feared because you are powerful, or powerful because people fear you? Neither. He was powerful because he was willing to stand in the open when every rational calculation said he should be behind walls. He was powerful because he had stopped letting the crown decide what he was afraid of. He was powerful because a woman in muddy boots had shown him that strength was not the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to act despite it. And tomorrow, that willingness would be tested against 6,000 soldiers and the woman who knew his weaknesses better than anyone alive. He returned to his tent, lay on his cot, closed his eyes. Sleep did not come, but something else did. A sound, faint at first, growing louder through the darkness. Hoofbeats, fast, coming from the west. Thorne was on his feet before the sentry's call reached his ears. He threw on his coat and stepped outside. The camp was stirring, soldiers rising from bedrolls, reaching for weapons, eyes scanning the western darkness for the source of the approaching rider. The horse burst through the outer perimeter at a full gallop, lathered and trembling, carrying a figure that was too small to be Kael. The rider pulled up hard. The horse skidded on wet grass. And in the firelight, Thorne saw a face he had been carrying inside his chest for weeks. Seraphine dismounted before the horse had fully stopped. She was covered in road dust. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come loose and fell across her face in dark, wind-blown tangles. She was breathing hard, the ragged respiration of someone who had been riding for days without adequate rest. She carried a leather satchel pressed against her chest like armor. Thorne crossed the distance between them in 4 strides. Around them, soldiers watched. Commanders emerged from tents. The entire camp held its breath because they all knew who she was. The rumor had spread faster than any courier, and they were watching their king's face for the first time, seeing something other than command. Where is Kael? She caught her breath. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, with urgency. 2 hours behind me. He sent me ahead. Thorne, listen to me. Selene knows about the ledgers. She sent riders to Ashen Hollow. Kael intercepted them, but it cost time. He is coming with 50 men, but he had to fight through a Valor patrol on the eastern pass. Is he hurt? I do not know. He put me on a fresh horse and told me to ride and not stop. Thorne looked at the satchel, the ledgers, everything, 18 months, every name, every transaction, every grain shipment stolen by every official in Lucien's network. She held the satchel out to him. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not. They carried the glassy brightness of exhaustion pushed past its limits, the look of a woman who had ridden for days through hostile territory carrying evidence that could save an empire, not because she cared about empires, but because the man standing in front of her had asked. Thorne took the satchel, felt its weight. Not heavy. Light, actually. A few pounds of leather and paper that contained the truth about what had been done to his people. Funny how the most powerful weapons were always lighter than you expected. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at him. The campfire threw their shadows long and tangled across the ground behind them. "You should not have come. You should not have sent for me. This is a battlefield. Then it is the right place for the truth to be." Somewhere to the south, in the darkness beyond the firelight, the ground began to tremble. Not wind, not thunder, thousands of boots, thousands of hooves, the low growing vibration of an army on the move, closing the distance faster than expected, arriving in darkness instead of dawn. Celine was not waiting for morning. She was coming now. Thorne turned south. The trembling grew. Torches appeared on the horizon, a long burning line stretching east to west, filling the darkness with the orange glow of approaching war. Commander Voss was beside him in seconds. "They are early, at least 4 hours ahead of our estimate. She forced a night march. She does not want us ready. We are not ready." Thorne looked at the approaching lights, at the army bearing down on 3,000 men who had expected to have until dawn to prepare, at the darkness that was filling with the sound of steel and horses and the particular rumble that preceded violence on a scale most people never experienced. Then he looked at Seraphine. Standing in a military camp she had no business being in, carrying evidence she had no obligation to deliver, having ridden across an empire for a man she had no reason to love, except that she did. And the king made his decision. He drew his sword. The sound cut through the camp like a voice louder than thunder. 3,000 men heard that sound and understood what it meant. The waiting was over. "Form the line." The line formed in darkness. 3,000 men moving with the desperate efficiency of soldiers who understood that the difference between readiness and death was measured in minutes, not hours. Torches flared along the front, shields locked, spears angled forward, cavalry mounted and wheeled into position on the flanks, horses snorting clouds of white breath into the frozen air, hooves stamping the wet ground with the nervous percussion of animals who could smell what was coming before their riders could see it. Thorne stood at the center of the line, not behind it, not on a hill overlooking it, in it, shoulder to shoulder with infantry who had never stood this close to their king and who drew from his presence something that no tactical formation could provide. The irrational, unreasonable, biologically hardwired confidence that came from seeing the man who carried the crown standing in the same mud, holding the same steel, facing the same darkness. Seraphine was behind the line. Thorne had ordered her to the rear camp with the supply wagons and the field surgeons. She had argued. He had not argued back. He had simply looked at her with an expression that communicated everything language could not, and she had gone.